They needed a name worthy of what they were about to attempt. NASA manager Abe Silverstein chose it one quiet evening in early 1960, Apollo, the Greek god who drove the sun across the sky. He named it the way a man names his child. He knew it had to carry weight, but the dream was bigger than the plan. Apollo was born under Eisenhower, not as a moon mission, but as a next step beyond Mercury. 3 astronauts instead of 1, bigger ambitions. Possible destinations included space stations, lunar flybys, but the moon itself, not yet. Then the world changed. November 1960. John F. Kennedy wins the presidency, and with him comes a promise. America would not just compete with the Soviet Union in space, it would win. Then came the blow no one was ready for. April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space, and America is left watching from the ground. The fear was real, the pressure immense. Kennedy had to act. On May 25, 1961, he stood before Congress and said the words that would define a decade. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. The mission was no longer a dream, it was a deadline. The goal was set, but could it actually be done? When Kennedy made his promise, only one American had ever been to space, and NASA hadn't even managed an orbit yet. Even people inside NASA had their doubts. The clock was running and the finish line seemed impossibly far. There was no room for slow, no room for error. NASA scrapped the old designs and moved fast, locking in Faje's command and service module as the blueprint. On November 28, 1961, North American Aviation won the contract to build it. The race had a rocket. Now it needed everything else, and everything else was staggering. 400,000 people, 20,000 companies, $25 billion, nearly $187 billion in today's money. It was the largest peacetime investment any nation had ever made. New centers were built from the ground up. The Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama to design the Saturn rockets, the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston to run the missions, and a massive new Launch Operations Center in Florida to send them skyward. Kennedy said it himself at Rice University in 1962, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." Hard was an understatement, but there was no turning back now. The plan was chosen, now someone had to actually build it, and what they had to build had never existed before. The command module, a cone, barely 12 feet wide, 3 astronauts crammed inside for a journey of 500,000 miles, there and back. It had to survive a fiery re-entry at 25,000 miles per hour, then splash down softly into the ocean. One heat shield between the crew and instant incineration. It was the only part of Apollo that never fundamentally changed, because it had to be right from the start. The service module, attached beneath, the engine, the fuel, the power, the oxygen, everything the crew needed to survive in the void. And at the very end, just before re-entry, it would be cut loose and left to burn up alone, its job done, discarded. But neither of those was the most daring piece of engineering. That was the lunar module. Grumman built it, and what they built was unlike anything that had ever flown. It would never touch Earth's atmosphere, never needed wings, never needed to be streamlined or elegant. It only needed to do one thing: land 2 men on the moon and bring them back up to orbit alive. So they stripped it down to almost nothing: spindly legs, crinkled foil skin, 2 engines, one to descend, one to ascend. If the ascent engine failed, even once, the crew was not coming home. No backup, no second chance. Just 2 astronauts, a fragile machine, and the surface of the moon. The goal was clear. The path was not. How do you land a man on the moon and bring him back alive? NASA's brightest minds argued over 4 possible routes, each one a gamble, each one a potential death sentence if they got it wrong. Direct ascent, one massive rocket, straight to the moon. Simple, but it would require a launch vehicle so powerful it barely existed on paper. Earth orbit rendezvous. Assemble the spacecraft in orbit first. Up to 15 launches, 15 chances for something to go wrong. Lunar surface rendezvous. Send a robot to the moon first, loaded with fuel. Then send the crew, and hope the fuel was still there. And then, the idea almost nobody wanted to hear. Lunar orbit rendezvous. Split the spacecraft in two. One ship stays in orbit. A smaller lander descends to the surface. Then somehow, in lunar orbit, 250,000 miles from Earth, the two pieces find each other again. It sounded like madness, but one man wouldn't let it go. John Houbolt, an engineer at Langley, fought for LOR when almost everyone dismissed it. He bypassed the chain of command. He wrote memo after memo. He called himself a voice in the wilderness and kept going anyway. Slowly, painfully, NASA came around. Then came the politics. Kennedy's own science advisor, Jerome Wiesner, publicly opposed the decision, even during a presidential visit, blurting out, "No, that's no good," in front of cameras as von Braun presented the plan. NASA held firm. The debate raged all the way to the edge of the Cuban Missile Crisis before Wiesner finally backed down. In November 1962, Grumman was awarded the contract to build the lunar lander. The path was chosen. There was no going back. And years later, when an oxygen tank exploded on Apollo 13 and left the crew stranded, it was that madman's idea, the lunar module, that brought them home alive. To reach the moon, you don't just need a rocket. You need the biggest rocket ever built by human hands. The man behind it was Wernher von Braun, once a rocket engineer for Nazi Germany, now the most important engineer in America. He had been working on massive launch vehicles long before Apollo had a name. Now, with the moon as the target, everything had to be rethought. Everything had to be bigger. The original plan demanded a rocket so enormous it was called Nova, capable of hurling over 180,000 pounds toward the moon in one shot. Then came the LOR decision, and Nova died on paper. In its place, the Saturn V, 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, taller than a 36-story building. When its 5 first-stage engines ignited, they produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust, enough to shake the ground miles away, enough to be heard from 100 miles out. It was not a machine. It was a controlled explosion pointed at the sky. But before Saturn V could fly, smaller rockets had to prove the way. Saturn I tested the waters, launching dummy stages, then boilerplate capsules, quietly verifying that the math was right. Then came Saturn 1B, upgraded, more powerful, enough to carry a crew into Earth orbit. Each launch a rehearsal, each success a step closer, and all of it building toward one moment when the full Saturn V would ignite and 3 men would ride that controlled explosion all the way to the moon. Before the rockets, before the moon, someone had to choose the men. That job belonged to one person, Deke Slayton, one of the original Mercury 7, grounded by a heart murmur before he ever flew. He would never go to space, not yet, but he would decide who did. Every Gemini crew, every Apollo crew, the most powerful unflown astronaut in NASA history. He had 32 men to work with. 24 of them would leave Earth's orbit entirely, flying around the moon between 1968 and 1972. 12 would walk on its surface, and 3 would never make it off the launch pad alive. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. But that comes later. For those who flew, the mission was a sequence of steps so precise, so unforgiving, that a single mistake at any stage meant death. Ignition. Saturn V burns for 11 minutes. Earth orbit achieved. Translunar injection. The third stage fires again, 6 minutes, and the moon stops being a destination and becomes a deadline. Docking. The command module pulls away, turns 180 degrees, and docks nose to nose with the lunar module. Two spacecraft become one. Then, 3 days of silence, of drifting, of checking and rechecking every system while the Earth shrinks behind them and the Moon grows ahead. Lunar orbit. The engine fires behind the Moon, out of radio contact with Earth, and either slows them into orbit or doesn't. No one on Earth would know for several agonizing minutes. Descent. 2 astronauts crawl into the lunar module. The hatch closes, they separate, and they fall, controlled, precise, terrifying, towards the surface. Landing. The commander takes manual control. The surface rushes up. Then, silence. They're down. And now the clock starts over. Because getting down was only half the mission. The ascent engine has to fire. Has to. One shot, no backup. If it fails, 2 men stay on the Moon forever. It fires. They rise. They find the command module waiting in orbit. They dock. They transfer. They leave the lunar module behind and head home. Re-entry. The service module is cut loose and burns up alone. The command module flips around, heat shield forward, and hits the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. A fireball surrounds it. Radio goes dark. For several minutes, nothing. Then parachutes. Then splashdown. Then recovery. Then, finally, they're home. Every single step had to work, in sequence, perfectly. 32 men trusted that it would. Before Apollo could reach the Moon, it had to survive the ground. January 27, 1967, Launch Complex 34, Cape Canaveral. It was supposed to be a routine test, no fuel, no launch, just a simulation. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, sealed inside their capsule, running through the checklist, and then a spark. In a cabin filled with pure oxygen, the fire didn't just burn, it exploded. Within seconds, the pressure blew the inner wall apart. By the time anyone reached the hatch, it was already over. 3 men, gone, on the ground, never having left Earth. NASA stopped, investigated, rebuilt, and quietly, grimly, kept going. The program clawed its way back, mission by mission. Apollo 4, Apollo 5, Apollo 6, uncrewed, methodical, testing every system until failure wasn't an option anymore. Then, October 1968, Apollo 7, the first crew back in space. 11 days in Earth orbit, every system checked, every box ticked. Then came the bold move nobody saw coming. The lunar module wasn't ready. NASA could have waited. Instead, Apollo 8 made a decision that stunned the world. No lunar module, no landing attempt. Just 3 men, Borman, Lovell, Anders, strapped to a Saturn V and aimed directly at the Moon. On Christmas Eve, 1968, they orbited it, transmitted live television of a desolate ancient surface, and read from Genesis to a watching world. The Soviets had sent tortoises around the Moon just months earlier. America had sent men. The race had a new leader. Apollo 9, Apollo 10. More rehearsals, more precision. Apollo 10 flew the lunar module to within 50,000 feet of the surface, close enough to see landing craters, then pulled back. The final dress rehearsal was done. July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong and Aldrin descended. Collins orbited alone, the loneliest human being in the universe, behind the Moon, out of contact with Earth. Below, the Eagle touched down. The Eagle has landed. And then Armstrong stepped out and said the words that will outlast everything. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But the Moon wasn't finished with them yet. April 1970, Apollo 13. 2 days from the Moon, an oxygen tank exploded. The service module died. 3 astronauts, stranded 250,000 miles from Earth, crawled into the lunar module, the fragile little lander that John Houbolt had fought so hard for, and used it as a lifeboat. They made it home. The missions continued. Apollo 14, 15, 16, each one going farther, staying longer, bringing back more. Lunar rovers now, driving across the surface, beaming live color television back to Earth. But the money was running out. The world had moved on. Apollo 18, 19, 20, canceled. Not because they failed, because they succeeded too well. The Moon had been reached. The race had been won. and Washington had other bills to pay. December 1972, Apollo 17, the last men on the moon. Gene Cernan stepped back into the lunar module, looked at the surface one final time, and said, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." The hatch closed, the ascent engine fired, and humanity left the moon. It hasn't been back since. They reached it, but what did it cost? $25.4 billion. In 1960s money, today, closer to $257 billion. Let that settle for a moment. The spacecraft, the Saturn rockets, the engines, the spacesuits, the launch pads, the tracking stations scattered across the globe, the hundreds of thousands of people who gave years of their lives to make it happen. At its peak, Apollo employed over 400,000 people and consumed more than half of everything NASA spent in the entire decade. When NASA first tried to estimate the cost in the early 1960s, they guessed $7 to $12 billion. Administrator James Webb, knowing what these things actually cost when governments build them, doubled it before telling Vice President Johnson. He was still short. The final bill was nearly double his estimate. And then there were the rocks. 382 kilograms of the moon came back with them. Ancient, scarred, unlike anything ever found on Earth. The youngest were 3.2 billion years old. The oldest, 4.6 billion. Older than almost anything on our planet. Remnants of the solar system's first moments. One of them, the Genesis rock, pulled from the highlands by Scott and Irwin on Apollo 15, is believed to be a piece of the moon's original crust, a fossil of creation itself, and from studying all of them, scientists pieced together what no one had proven before, that the moon was born from a catastrophic collision, a planet-sized body slamming into the early Earth, hurling debris into orbit that slowly gathered into the world we see every night. Half a century of study, all from 842 pounds of gray rock carried home by 12 men. But by 1969, the crowds had gone home. The world had watched the landing and moved on. President Nixon wanted to cut spending. Congress had other priorities. NASA's budget shrank year after year. Each mission cost an average of $445 million. The space shuttle needed funding. Something had to give. Apollo 18, 19, 20, canceled. The last dollar of Apollo funding was spent in 1973. The moon waited, as it always had, in silence. The moon was done, but the hardware wasn't. NASA had rockets, capsules, engineers who had spent a decade solving the impossible. You don't just park all of that, so they dreamed bigger. The plans poured out. Apollo Extension Series, Apollo Applications Program, up to 30 more flights, orbital laboratories, space workshops built from empty rocket stages, and the most audacious idea of all, taking an empty Saturn upper stage and flying it past Venus. A crude interplanetary mission built from leftover moon hardware. Most of it stayed on paper, but one idea made it off the drawing board: Skylab. They took a Saturn V, the greatest rocket ever built, stripped away its mission to the moon, and used it to hurl an entire space station into orbit. Not assembled in space, built on the ground, launched whole. 3 crews lived aboard it. They studied the sun through the Apollo telescope mount. They ran experiments. They proved that human beings could live and work in space for months at a time. Then the money ran out. The space shuttle was coming, eventually, and NASA couldn't afford to save Skylab long enough to reach it. On July 11, 1979, Skylab fell back to Earth, pieces scattered across the Australian outback. No one was hurt, the greatest space station of its era, gone. But Apollo had one last act. July 1975, the Cold War still simmering. 2 superpowers who had spent a decade racing each other to the moon, now docking their spacecraft together in orbit. An American Apollo capsule, a Soviet Soyuz. Crews shaking hands through an airlock 140 miles above the Earth. It wasn't a competition anymore. It was a handshake. Apollo-Soyuz, the first joint mission between nations in space, quietly planted the seed for everything that followed. The space shuttle, the International Space Station, decades of cooperation that are still ongoing today. Apollo didn't just reach the moon, it taught humanity how to reach each other. Of all the things humanity managed to pull off, landing on the moon, bringing the men home, doing it 6 times, there is one thing they could not manage, Holding onto the footage, in 2006, NASA began searching for the original videotapes of Apollo 11's moonwalk. The moment. The moment. Neil Armstrong's boot touching the surface, the most watched broadcast in human history. They searched for 3 years. Archives, storage facilities, boxes, old reels. Anything, nothing. The conclusion, when it finally came, was almost too absurd to believe. The tapes had almost certainly been erased and reused. Magnetic tape was expensive. Storage space was limited. Someone somewhere had made a bureaucratic decision, and the original recordings of humanity's greatest achievement were quietly recorded over. Gone. What remains is what the world watched on television that night. Grainy, compressed, broadcast through satellite and antenna into living rooms around the planet. A restored version was released in 2009, cleaned up as much as modern technology allowed. It's remarkable footage, but it is not the original. Somewhere in the history of a program that spent $25 billion reaching the moon, nobody kept the tape. The moon remembers. The footprints are still there. The tape is not.